thank you. It's an honor to be with you this morning. And before I begin, I would like to personally witness to the truth, to the goodness and beauty of the teachings of Humanae Vitae. Throughout our 15 years of marriage, my wife and I have faced the existential, moral challenges, difficulties of conjugal life. However, we have thoroughly lived out the teachings of Humanae Vitae, and even at times when they seem to be counterintuitive, they have truly been a law of life for us. I would say they've been one main reason of keeping our love alive. And of course, that's been very beneficial to ourselves and to our children. So we're so thankful for the life-giving law or laws of Humanae Vitae. I provided a handout for all of you that you could locate it in your folders that you've received to help us along our way. Now, the main purpose of my talk is more or less following the call of the Second Vatican Council to root theological anthropology and moral theology in its biblical foundations. And so in a way, this talk is kind of a biblical catechetical account of the teachings of Humanae Vitae and Veritatis Splendor. In particular, my purpose is to root the understanding of the integral vision of man in certain key scriptural texts. 3 of them, in fact. And the first one is Sirach 15:14. Each of these texts are referred to one way or another in Humanae Vitae or Veritatis Splendor. Let's look at the first text that I'd like to highlight from Sirach 15:14. It states, "It was God who created man in the beginning, and he left him in the power of his own counsel." Now this text, which I'd like to argue is a real cornerstone for theological anthropology, I'd like to highlight 2 things about this text. The first thing is that it explicitly indicates that the Creator's loving gift of existence to man in the beginning also includes a further gift, namely the gift of the power of man's very own counsel or freedom. Human freedom makes manifest that since the beginning, God himself freely created the human person with a certain spiritual interiority or inner life, where he can deliberate over various alternatives, is able to reason through different means to an end, and may make rational judgments and choices in freedom for the sake of human action. This verse underlines that the human person acts of himself and determines himself by his own movement proper to him. The second thing I'd like to underline is that in gifting man with his very being and with the power to freely act of himself, God has created man in his image and likeness. And we heard about this last night. As a manifestation of the divine image, the human person, through his freedom, is called to share in God's creative dominion over the world. Now, what is the relationship between mankind and the world? And again, we heard a lot about this last night from Dr. Wallstein. Sirach 15:14 indicates man's uniqueness, for to no other creature besides man did God leave in the rational power of its own counsel. His extraordinary rational power of self-determination indicates that man alone understands the goods created by God and is empowered to deliberately pursue them. And therefore it is he who is given the privilege to make use of the entire created world for himself. All created things are ordered to man and his good. Now, here comes the first quote that you can see on your handout, quote number 1. "Hence man's freedom then is a chief mark of the greatness of his dignity, a transcendent dignity among creatures, for it reveals, in the words of Veritatis Splendor 13, the singular dignity of the human person, the only creature God willed for its own sake." Although Sirach 15:14 makes clear that man is not the absolute and unconditional origin of his freedom, it does reveal that because God has chosen and gifted man out of his love with the power of his own counsel, that man is in fact an end in himself, and therefore he is truly godlike among all creatures. Now furthermore, as the sole creature who God has willed for its own sake, the human person is unique precisely as a being that is non-transferable and incommunicable, which means that no other person can will something in his stead. No other person may usurp his self-determining power. Hence, because the human person, as an end in himself, is authentically self-reliant in his actions, he ought not to be used as a means to an end. Thus, Sirach 15:14 reveals a fundamental moral law that governs the human person. Let's turn to our second text. This is from Jesus in the Gospels. But before we do so, it's just one more thing that's related. Although Sirach 15:14 is a cornerstone to adequate theological anthropology, it still does not identify the precise nature of freedom. Is freedom the power to do anything one wills arbitrarily? Is freedom in and of itself the goal of human existence, having autonomy from and primacy over truth, even to the point of denying human nature? Or on the other hand, is freedom the capacity to do as one ought to do? Is it a necessary condition for knowing the truth and willing the good? We could put the question this way. Having left man in the power of his own counsel, did God entrust the human person to the person's own care and responsibility? If so, how does man care for himself? How is he responsible for himself? How does he reach his true good? How does he reach happiness? Now, in attempting to identify the nature of freedom, we see from Sirach 15 that freedom is related to law. For not only does Sirach, in referring to the beginning of creation, call to mind the covenant law God gave to man in the Garden of Eden, but it also reveals, as we've just seen, a law that governs the human person and his relation to other persons. Namely, because he is an end in himself, the person must never be used as a means to an end. What is evident here is that God alone possesses the power to determine what is good and what is evil. Man does not. Furthermore, because of his love for man, God has promulgated certain laws for the sake of man, that he may obtain what is good for him. For example, at a fundamental level, it is good for all persons, everywhere, and for everyone, to live according to the primordial moral requirement never to use another person as a means to an end. Thus, it is evident here that freedom neither consists in the removal of external restraint for the sake of independent choosing, nor is it purely self-designing. Rather, freedom is here understood as the power of man to determine himself, to accept or deny a law for the sake of either obtaining the good God has willed for him or not. Therefore, in granting him the power of freedom, God entrusted the human person to the person's own care and responsibility, so that, in the words of Veritatis Splendor 39, quote, he might seek his Creator and freely attain perfection, end quote. Now, the attainment of such perfection in God is reached through the law of the Messiah, Jesus, the only begotten Son of the Father. One of Jesus' moral laws, which is remarkably found in each of the four Gospels and is stated twice in both the Gospel of Matthew and Luke, is clearly fundamental in locating the good one must do to inherit eternal life. Namely, whoever saves his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will save it. And this is our second text. Now, the first thing to note is that Jesus' moral law, in each of its 6 gospel expressions, concerns a moral choice between two different kinds of goods. For example, in Luke 17, immediately prior to presenting this law, Jesus says, "On that day, let him who is on the housetop, with his goods in the house, not come down to take them away. And likewise, let him who is in the field not turn back. Remember Lot's wife." Jesus is contrasting the goods of the house, or in the field, with the good of the coming of the Son of Man. Throughout Luke 17, there are several indicators that the good of the Son of Man is a greater good than the goods in the field. First, a good like the Son of Man is a universal one for all people to possess. Such a benefit stands in contrast to the goods in the field, which only exist as a possession of one person at one time. Secondly, unlike the goods which were destroyed in the days of Noah and Lot, which again we heard a bit about last night, it is assumed that the good of the Son of Man will not be destroyed or diminished, even though it can be given simultaneously to all people. He is an enduring good, which remains intact, an intact whole even when it is shared among many followers. In contrast, when shared with another, one's goods in the house are diminished and at times even destroyed. These reasons, among others, make it clear that the good of the Son of Man is a manifestly greater one than any of the goods in the field. Let us look more closely at Jesus' law itself. The first half discloses the end that is to be avoided. Whoever would save his life will lose it. This seems to refer to an inordinate preoccupation with private advantages, such as those mentioned by Jesus, again, throughout Luke 17, food, drink, businesses, commodities, property, homes. Although, of course, they are necessary and surely neither evil things in themselves, nonetheless, a disordered attachment to earthly things will lead to disaster when they are sought in a place which usurps a follower's quest for the goods which are both common to all and transcendent, such as the Son of Man and his kingdom. Otherwise, if a disciple attempts to acquire his life through a capitalization of earthly possessions, he will lose it, as in the case of Lot's wife. The second half of Jesus' teaching, whoever loses his life will save or find it, manifests what a disciple is losing his life for. Different from our relation to the goods in the house, which we order to ourselves by taking them to ourselves, as Jesus relates in Luke 17. When we recognize the day of the coming of the Son of Man, a day in which a benefit outside of the house is given for the entire world, we ought to, in all freedom, lose our life by ordering it first and foremost to that good. Rather than requiring physical death or an act of suicide, to lose one's life appears in a positive form within the moral order as a test to sacrifice placing one's own individual commodities in the preferred place for the sake of pursuing with greater love the transcendent common good of the community, which he himself is a part, and therefore he personally shares in its goodness. Now, this law of the Messiah manifests that a person not only possesses himself as an end, but it further reveals that he is able to define his ends in relation to transcendent goods, like the Son of Man. Freely heeding this law to lose his life for the sake of such a good results in a full flourishing of human freedom, for it has reached the end of its natural self-determining movement. Veritatis Splendor states, quote, "Freedom is acquired in love, in the gift of self," end quote. In turn, this gift of self to the good in the fullness of human freedom results in a greater self-possession of finding oneself. It leads to being fully alive as a human person. Here we see that human freedom and divine law coincide and appeal to one another. In the words of the Apostle James, the law of the Messiah here is indeed the perfect law, the law of perfect liberty, through which he will be blessed in his doing. End quote. Jesus says this much himself, doesn't he? The truth will set you free. Veritatis Splendor 84 states, quote, only the freedom which submits to the truth leads the human person to his true good. The good of the person is to be in the truth and to do the truth. End quote. Here lies the fulfillment of the human person, his freedom, and his dignity. As Veritatis Splendor 34 concludes, this is the second quote in your handout. Quote, genuine freedom is an outstanding manifestation of the divine image in man. For God willed to leave man in the power of his own counsel, so that he would seek his Creator of his own accord and would freely arrive at full and blessed perfection by cleaving to God. Now, because Jesus fully reveals man to himself and makes his supreme calling clear, Veritatis Splendor, following the entire Christian tradition, holds that the fullness of authentic freedom is made possible only in and through Jesus Christ and his revelation. As the Messiah, Jesus encounters the weakness and tragic aspects of man's freedom, which is, to quote Veritatis Splendor 86, quote, inclined to betray this openness to the true and to the good. And that all too often he actually prefers to choose finite, limited goods. Or worse, in his freedom, man glimpses the source of a deep rebellion, which leads him to reject the truth and the good in order to set himself up as an absolute principle unto himself. You will be like God, quoting Genesis 3:5 at the fall of man. However, as the Redeemer of man, Christ, realizing that freedom itself needs to be set free, is the one who does so. In the words of St. Paul, for freedom Christ has set us free. Christ accomplished this in the fullness of his own freedom by truly living in accordance with his fundamental law, by losing his life in his passion and death out of obedience to the Father, by uncompromisingly loving the benefits of all above and beyond the love he had for his own life. Veritatis Splendor 87 remarks, and this is quote number 3 on your handout, Jesus then is the living, personal summation of perfect freedom in total obedience to the will of God. His crucified flesh fully reveals the unbreakable bond between freedom and truth, just as his resurrection from the dead is the supreme exaltation of the fruitfulness and saving power of a freedom lived out in truth. It goes on to boldly claim, the crucified Christ reveals the authentic meaning of freedom. He lives it fully in the total gift of himself and calls his disciples to share in his freedom. Thus, in heeding Jesus' call to follow him in freedom, which is radically expressed in his words, whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life will save it. This marks, to quote Veritatis Splendor 66, quote, the greatest possible exaltation of human freedom, end quote. This is the magnificent paradox of human existence, revealed by Christ the Redeemer, that includes the whole truth about man. In summary, then, according to Veritatis Splendor 86, and this is quote number 4, freedom quote, is at once inalienable self-possession and openness to all that exists, in passing beyond self to knowledge and love of the other. Freedom is then rooted in the truth about man and is ultimately directed towards communion, end quote. Here, Veritatis Splendor 86 refers to Gaudium et Spes 24:3, which may serve as a recapitulation of these two fundamental biblical laws governing the human person, operative at a deep level in Humanae Vitae and Veritatis Splendor. Let's quote Gaudium et Spes 24:3. This is quote number 5 in your handout. Indeed, the Lord Jesus, when he prays to the Father that all may be one as we are one, and thus offers vistas closed to human reason, indicates a certain likeness between the union of the divine persons and the union of God's sons in truth and charity. This likeness shows that man, who is the only creature on earth which God willed for itself, the first law disclosed in Sirach 15, and here now comes the law of Jesus, cannot fully find himself except through a sincere gift of himself. And it refers to Luke 17:33 there. Now to the third and last scripture text. From Jesus' maxim, whoever loses his life will find or save it, one may gather that the fullness of human freedom, the fullness of self-possession, the fullness of human life and of salvation, concern only the soul. For the Greek word for life is psyche, which literally means soul. A more literal reading would be, whoever loses his soul will save it. Is Jesus implying a dualism between soul and body, where the person is his soul but is not his body? Moreover, is the soul alone saved and not the body? To begin answering these questions, we can return to Sirach 15, where it is clear that God left the power of freedom precisely to man, anthropos, and not to a soul in contrast to the human body. In good ancient Jewish form, in which the dualistic antithesis body-soul does not appear, we can safely hold that for Sirach 15, rational freedom is intimately intermingled with all the bodily and sense faculties. In other words, the power of freedom is in man, considered as a unified whole, soul and body, as an integrated, embodied spirit. Thus, freedom then is rooted in the truth about man, the whole truth about man. Now, St. Paul confirms this teaching that the human person is a unified whole, soul and body, especially by underlining the very redemption of the body in Romans 8:23. And it reads, not only the creation, but we ourselves, who have the first fruits of the Spirit, groan inwardly as we wait for adoption as sons, the redemption of our body. St. Paul can speak of the redemption of our body precisely because the human body is essentially constitutive of the human person. The human person, according to Veritatis Splendor 50, is a unified totality as a soul which expresses itself in the body and is informed by an immortal spirit. It goes on to teach that, quote, the body and soul are inseparable. In the person, in the willing agent, and in the deliberate act, they stand and fall together, end quote. In light of the composite unity of the human person, what exactly is the purpose and function of the body? According to St. John Paul II, in Man and Woman He Created Him, a theology of the body, henceforth cited TOB, the person possesses a body and is a body in the sense that a person is revealed through his body. It makes visible what is invisible. And therefore, it cannot be reduced to the visible world alone. The human body is not merely a biological reality, possessing biological laws and functions, but furthermore, it is at the same time the medium of the expression of the person as an integral whole. St. John Paul II states in TOB 12, the human body expresses the person in his or her ontological and essential concreteness, and thus expresses the human personal I, which grounds its exterior perception from within. Only through the body the person speaks. Thus, the human body must not be reduced to a raw material dictum, devoid of any meaning and moral value until freedom has shaped it in accordance with its own self-design. In a similar vein, the human person can neither be reduced to a spiritual and purely formal freedom, nor be reduced to a materialistic identification with his body. If the person speaks, as it were, only through the body, at a fundamental level, what does the person say through his body? And if we need to reclaim language, which was so well highlighted by Dr. von Goisau, here we also need to reclaim the language of the body. I propose that the manifest meaning of the body is rooted in and expresses the integral truth about man, which is the person himself in the unity of soul and body, who is governed by the two theological laws respectively expressed in Sirach 15 and by Jesus in the Gospels. Thus, the first fundamental truth that the person speaks through his body is that God left him with the rational power of his own counsel. The human body is, quoting John Paul II in TOB 27, a witness and perceptible verification of the human person's power of knowledge and self-determination, end quote. In other words, common experience discovers that the rationality and freedom of the person is intimately associated with bodily dimensions and is manifested in and through them. A person not only expresses that he is self-determining and an incommunicable creature chosen by eternal love for his own sake in and through his body, but furthermore, that he is free and non-transferable is recognized by others in and through his body. This is the manifestation and identification, therefore, of what Veritatis Splendor calls, quote, the specific human meaning of the body, end quote. The second foundational truth that the person speaks through his body is the loving gift of self for the sake of others implied in Jesus' law to lose your life to find it. Veritatis Splendor 48 states, the person, by the light of reason and the support of virtue, discovers in the body the anticipatory signs, the expression, and the promise of the gift of self, in conformity with the wise plan of the Creator, end quote. This is the chief reason why the human body has been created, to enable a person to communicate knowledge of himself to others, and to express his love for them precisely as persons willed for their own sake by their Creator, and conversely, to receive through the body knowledge and love of others. In short, the purpose of the body is to express personal love, or a love that generates a communion of persons. This is a general expression and recognition of what Veritatis Splendor 49 calls the moral meaning of the body. More specifically, in enjoyment of the whole truth of the other, through their gift of self to one another, in and through their bodies, which expresses femininity for masculinity and masculinity for femininity, man and woman, most fully in marriage, find each other and reciprocally welcome each other in a communion of persons, inasmuch as the Creator willed each of them for their own sake. In this, writes John Paul II, consists the revelation and discovery of the spousal meaning of the body. In light of this, it follows that because God left man in the fullness of his soul-body unity, in the power of his own counsel, that his existence is not governed solely by biological laws. Rather, man is a free, self-guided being who is an end in himself, called in love to lose his life to find it, precisely as an embodied spirit. And therefore, in addition, moral laws govern him, especially the foundational laws revealed in Sirach 15 and by Jesus in the Gospels. Now, as the progression of our account has indicated, for the person to speak the whole truth about himself through his body, he must necessarily speak both truths, one after the other, as it were. In his actions with other persons, he must simultaneously affirm both the human meaning of the body as well as the moral, spousal meaning of the body. For the former is the root and foundation of the latter, just as the latter is the fulfillment and perfection of the former. St. John Paul II states in TOB 15, quote, "One can understand this spousal meaning of the body only in the context of the person," or in other words, only in the context of the human meaning of the body. In this way, for one to live according to the moral spousal meaning of the body, one must first discover, through the body of the other, that the person before them is truly a person with a rational nature, possessing the power of self-determination, and is therefore an end in himself. Such a discovery leads to the affirmation that the human person, again as a soul and body composite, ought never to be used as a means to an end. Once this foundational principle, revealed to us in Sirach 15, is known, then one realizes that the only adequate response to another person is love. Love for others, for all, is precisely what is called for in the second theological law of the human person, as articulated in Jesus' maxim, lose your life to save it. In conclusion, if one desires to rightly understand the basis for the theological anthropology and morality present in Humanae Vitae and Veritatis Splendor, then one must grasp the foundational biblical truths of the human and moral and spousal meanings of the body and the laws of the person they express. For they provide an integral foundation to understand the integral truth about man. For the redemption of the body, caused by the bodily resurrection of Jesus Christ, is the hope of St. Paul, as it is our hope. Our true happiness, towards which we aspire with all our being, lies precisely here in the hope of an integral anthropological, moral truth expressed in the resurrection of the body of Christ, as well as in the redemption of our bodies. Now, before I conclude, I would like to apply our conclusions about the integral truth of man to the concrete example that lies at the heart of Humanae Vitae, namely the example of the conjugal act and its relation to artificial means of birth control. Now, as stated above, the body in general reveals the transcendent dignity of the person who is an end in himself. As Veritatis Splendor 99 reminds us, quote, the human person is the subject of rights which no one may violate, no individual, group, class, nation, or state. End quote. More specifically, the body's masculinity and femininity disclose the person's natural ordination to communion of persons, generated in a mutual, loving gift of self between man and woman, especially realized in marriage in the conjugal act. Now, the conjugal act is not merely a biological act governed by biological laws. More so, it is a personal act, since it is an act of the person brought about within the whole truth of his soul-body reality and governed by personal laws. Because it is a personal act, the role of the body for husband and wife in the conjugal act is clear. It expresses their knowledge of each other and their love for each other, ordered to communion, precisely as persons who possess their respective freedom as creatures willed by God for their own sake. In other words, the conjugal act is a particular expression of the spousal meaning of the body. Among the many varied acts of knowledge and love made manifest via the body between husband and wife, the conjugal act is unique. And again, this was spoken so well of by Dr. Vashon last night, its uniqueness. This particular marital act of personal loving communion is specified by the fact that only through it a new human life may be conceived. In the conjugal act, both the husband and wife speak, as it were, a twofold statement through their bodies, namely, personal loving communion ordered towards generating life. Thus, what is revealed and discovered in it by each person, husband and wife, is not only the spousal meaning of the body, but also the generative or procreative meaning of the body. Because of their inseparable connection with each other in this one act, each meaning of the body simultaneously reveals the innermost truth of the conjugal act. Thus, for husband and wife to speak the whole truth about the conjugal act through their bodies, they need to simultaneously affirm and respect both the spousal meaning of the body as well as the generative meaning of the body. For, as John Paul II states in TOB 123, the one is realized together with the other, and in a certain way, the one through the other. If either the spousal or generative meaning of the body is excluded in the conjugal act, then the human meaning of the body is eclipsed. This act is reduced to a sub-personal act, since the person is subsequently used as a means to an end. Now, this is precisely what goes on when one uses artificial means of birth control. One chooses not to listen to the full speech of the body. Instead of reverencing and loving the whole truth about the person in his or her transcendent dignity, a couple utilizing artificial means of contraception prefers something less than the person, which in the end becomes a lesser private good, like a good in the house. In doing away with its ordering to procreation through technical manipulation of the body, artificial contraception obscures both fundamental theological laws that govern the human person and personal actions. First, it eradicates this particular kind of losing oneself in giving oneself through the body to one's spouse in the conjugal act, which in itself is ordered to procreation. With artificial contraception, the conjugal act ceases not only to be a procreative act, but due to their inseparability, it also ceases to be an act of self-giving love. By denying the generative meaning of the body, the spousal meaning of the body is also denied. Secondly, in employing it, the body and its pleasure is subsequently sought after for its own sake. Consequently, the total integral evidence of the human being and the entire worth of the person is reduced to bodily masculinity or femininity as a fitting object to satisfy only one's own bodily sexual urge. the person is treated as a mere private good for the satisfaction of the ends of another. This violates the first and fundamental law of the human person, disclosed by Sirach 15, that the human person, soul and body, is the only creature God willed for its own sake, and therefore should never be used as a means to an end. Hence, artificial contraception is an express denial of the human personal meaning of the body. In utilizing it, a husband and wife act towards each other in a subpersonal manner. Therefore, artificial contraception results in a reductive violation, not only of the innermost truth or order of the conjugal act, being simultaneously an act of reciprocal love and also potential fruitfulness, but also of the whole integral truth or order of the human person as revealed in the body. Through it, one favors a lesser individual good over and above the transcendent good of the person, their mutual love, and its ordering to new life. It's precisely here where the evil of the act of artificial contraception lies. To sum up, if a husband desires to respond adequately and properly towards his wife in the conjugal act and vice versa, he must there and then consciously discover and affirm what her body reveals, namely the human meaning of her body, along with its moral, spousal, and generative meanings. It is precisely this threefold conscious affirmation and reverence that Humanae Vitae demands in its account of the conjugal act. Listen to the words of St. John Paul II in TOB 118, and this is the seventh quote in your handout. The moral norm of Humanae Vitae 11 and 12, paragraph 11 and 12, constantly taught by the Church in this sphere, recalled and reconfirmed by Paul VI in his encyclical, springs from reading the language of the body in the truth. A living awareness of the integral truth of the human being concerns man's true good as a person, and if consciously lived, will bring a deep reciprocal enrichment and lasting marital happiness on our way towards eternal happiness with our God. St. John Paul II in TOB 30 sums up our entire account, and this is the summary statement, the last statement on the handout. He says, "This communion of persons has been intended to make man and woman mutually happy." I mean, this is what it's all about, isn't it? Our happiness. Humanae Vitae concerns our happiness in marriage and beyond. Now, how do we obtain happiness? Three things are underlined here. First, through the search of a simple and pure union in humanity. That's another way of saying what we've said, what Sirach 15 reveals, that man, through his freedom, is a creature willed for his own sake and should not be treated as a means to an end. What's the second way we need to be happy? Going back to the quote, through a reciprocal offering of ourselves, that is, through the experience of the gift of the person, expressed with soul and body, with masculinity and femininity. This is nothing other than lose yourself to find it. That you will only find yourself through a sincere gift of yourself, which of course includes your body. Lastly, and this pertains to marital happiness, conjugal happiness, through the subordination of such a union, to a conjugal union, to the blessing of fruitfulness with procreation. I hope that the biblical foundation that we have built up from these three texts, Sirach 15, Jesus' law and the Gospels, and Romans 8, helps to sharpen our perception of the goodness and beauty of the human person and of human love as revealed in God's plan and expressed in the human body. and in doing so sheds much light on the teaching of Humanae Vitae and Veritatis Splendor. Let these scripture texts help develop an inner consciousness and judgment and deep reverence that shapes a right Christian attitude toward living the body as a human person. Thank you.